Hey everybody, this is Jarred Marlowe from the Blue and Gray Education Society, and we have a really special guest with us tonight. And I say that for a couple reasons. The first is it's a very special connection to me, living in Southside, Southwest Virginia, but also special because this is probably the furthest geographical guest that we've ever had on this channel, Mr. Gareth Virr from the UK. How are things going, Gareth?
Not bad at all, thank you. Yourself?
Oh, can't complain here. Now, for people who are more knowledgeable in UK geography than I am, whereabouts do you live in the UK?
So I live just outside Leeds, which is kind of in the north of England. So about 3 hours north of London. It should help people pin it
Okay.
geographically.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of Leeds before. That's a common name. And for those of you who may be wondering why we have Gareth on here for being from the UK, well, Gareth and I actually share a pretty special connection. I was telling him right before he hopped on that, I live in Southwest Virginia, and a lot of the people's ancestors from Henry County, where I live, served in the 24th Virginia Infantry. Um, and I was looking up history on the 24th Virginia, and I stumbled across Gareth, who lives in the UK, and he and his buddies, his comrades, they do a historical reenactment of the 24th Virginia, specifically Company A, but still the 24th Virginia. So I thought that was pretty cool. Anything you want to add to that? Anything that I missed there?
No, not at all. And I think we'll get into the history of why we do what we do in a little bit. So I won't jump the gun on that one, but yeah, you've hit the nail right on the head there.
Yeah, so let's start out with just the obvious question. How is it that you and your group, all the way in the UK, found out? I mean, let's start with just basic Civil War. Like, how did you get interested in the American Civil War?
So a lot of us have, the guys in the group, we've got just about everybody's got a history of doing reenactment, living history in some sort of different period. I came to the Civil War side of things from doing Napoleonic. We've got guys that do medieval stuff, World War II. But I think, if you tend to come across living historians, reenactors, they've got an interest in more than just one period. I think most people will admit to that, even if it's just a fleeting interest. So, as I say, I started doing Napoleonic stuff, but it's not a million miles from Civil War in terms of history, even tactics and things like that. So the two have always been a natural interest point for me. I think it's easy to say. So having done Napoleonic reenactment for a long time and been to a lot of the big bicentennials in Spain and Portugal, Belgium and stuff like that, it just felt like a natural thing for me to move on to. I can't really speak for everybody in our group, what their individual paths were, why they've come to Civil War stuff from where they were, but everybody's got an interest in it. Some a little bit more in depth than others, and we'll probably touch on that as a conversation goes on. But we've I think most of us have always had an interest somewhere along the line in the American Civil War.
Right, and that's one thing I was curious about too, because America is celebrating its 250th birthday this year, and
Happy
as
birthday,
far
buddy.
oh, thank you. Yeah, here in about 2 months exactly, we'll be celebrating. But as far as country history goes, ours is fairly limited. If you want to be a war reenactor, you're typically limited to the American Revolution, American Civil War, World War I, World War II, and that's typically it. But I was wondering, how that worked with, a country with such a rich history. Obviously you answered it. You can go back Napoleon, medieval, all the way back. That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So, what was your first exposure to the Civil War? A lot of people say you hear, Ken Burns' Civil War, or even Ronald Maxwell's Gettysburg. So, what was your first exposure to the American Civil War?
Cliche, Gettysburg. It's simple as that. And I've actually, just before we came online, I've just actually heard of Ted Turner's passing, and that kind of hit. because that was my first exposure to the Civil War. And you know, I wasn't more than being about 7 or 8 when that film came out, and it is probably still, without a shadow of a doubt, my favourite film. I can put it on anytime, any day, and it just captivates me, the whole thing right the way through. It was just, I don't know what it is. There's something about it that just grips you and just takes you along for the ride. And it was the first thing that really did that for me with the American Civil War.
Right. Yeah. And absolutely. You know, I found out about his passing just a few hours ago myself. And that's, as far as Civil War, you know, or people who promoted the Civil War go, he was one of the biggest, you know, with Gettysburg and then later Gods and Generals. And just, you know, even though those movies weren't a financial success, what they did for the Civil War community was, you know, as they did as much, if not more, than Ken Burns did with his documentary series. It's just getting exposure out there and putting it in people's faces.
Yeah, that film, it'll transcend generations. It'll just keep going and going and going. And I'm sure in the future it'll spark interest in hundreds, thousands more people, you know, that will come into the hobby and the history of it from that.
Absolutely. You know, all right, diving a little bit more specific now. So we know about your interest in the American Civil War. How did you come across the 24th Virginia, and specifically Company A from Floyd County?
But this was a pure accident, really, how we ended up doing the 24th and specifically Company A. So back in 2017, here in the UK, we had, by UK standards, quite a large American Civil War event. There were several hundred Civil War reenactors, which for you guys is tiny, but for us it's huge. And we got invited by some friends. At this point, I was doing purely Napoleonic stuff, and friends that were in that group had friends that did American Civil War, and they'd done they portrayed the 24th Virginia, specifically Company C, so the Carroll County boys. They portrayed Company C, 24th Virginia, in the 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s. And in 2017, they basically said, this is it. This is our last event. It's a big one for us. We'll take it and go out with a bang. So they invited us along and said, do you guys want to come along? Not really strictly authentic with a lot of kit, but you know, when you get the opportunity to burn powder, you're sort of like, sure, yeah, I'll go. So a lot of us shipped over from Napoleonic and a couple from different units. And there were enough of us, there were probably about 20, just over 20 of us, that the old guys, if you like, that had done Company C said, come and join us. You can form your own company. We'll chuck you in as Company A. Like, yeah, winner, not a problem. Fantastic. Loved it. Absolutely loved the event. Everything about it. It just really, really, really lit that fire under doing Civil War living history. So, having heard that these guys were, hanging up the boots and whatever else, and us enjoying it so much, we said to them, would you have a problem if we carried the 24th on? The name of the 24th, at least. And we said, we don't want to step on your toes of doing Company C and representing Carroll County. And seeing as though we've been designated as Company A for this event, we said, we'll carry Company A on, so we're not stepping on your toes. And they said, yeah, go for it. Not a problem. So it was really purely by accident that we ended up portraying and carrying on the 24th name as Company A, the Floyd Riflemen.
So did they give you any insight as to why they chose 24th Company C, or?
No. I mean, that's probably a conversation to have. I'm still obviously in touch with quite a few of the guys. And it's not a question I've asked, I will be honest. It's not a question I've asked of them, but I just know that originally they were Company C, 24th, and we didn't want to not damage the reputation as such, but that's the wrong word for it. We didn't want to step on their toes and tarnish what they'd done as Company C. But we wanted to keep the 24th going, but go as a slightly separate entity, so we're not stepping on their toes. Simple as that.
Right. And like you and I talked about before we hit record, I mean, if you want to know anything about the Eastern Theater of the American Civil War, you can just follow the 24th. And maybe I can get you and Josh Lindemood on here one day, and we just talk 24th for a couple hours.
Definitely.
But like I said, that's a whole different topic for a whole different day. So, being in the UK, how do British audiences usually react to seeing an American Civil War reenactment, or seeing you guys kit out and set up somewhere?
It's a little bit unusual for a lot of people. Despite the fact, obviously, it's not fought over here, the American Civil War is still well known about, the world over, not just here in the UK. Everybody's with a slight interest in history has heard of the American Civil War in some way or another. So we do get some interesting looks, shall we say, from people, but by and large, when people start engaging with us and we have conversations at events, we'll come on to this, I'm sure, a little bit later as well, but we try and, I'm trying to think of the word here, it's promote, there we go, we sort of try and promote the UK links to the Civil War, and why it had such a huge impact for us over here, not just obviously the bloodshed that was caused over in the States, but how it severely affected the UK as a country, as an economy, and everything else. So there's a lot of links. So once you start talking to people, there is that little bit of shock and surprise, but it very quickly wears off once you start explaining why you're dressed as an American soldier from the 1860s.
Right, and I'm part of the Sons of the American Revolution here, and we go set up at different festivals and stuff too. And immediately, if you're wearing an antique military uniform, people are going to turn their heads and look, and that's an immediate draw into people. And I think it's awesome that you're setting that platform, like, hey, this is an American unit, but here are the links that we have. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So what are some memorable interactions that you've had, while setting up with people? Some moments that kind of took your breath away or took their breath away?
Well, we get it a lot. I think just about every conversation we have with people where we start pushing those UK links and why we're interested in it. I struggle really to think of one that's taken my breath away, where somebody's come up and asked us a question or whatever it may be. But I think it's always memorable when it's the opposite way. When you start talking to people and they're like, really? I didn't know that. Wow, seriously? You get a lot of reactions when you start pushing these UK links. So our first event of this season was a few weeks ago, and it was in North Wales, and you could spit and hit Liverpool. We're not far from Liverpool at that particular event, and if anybody knows anything really about Civil War history, we all tend to know that the last Confederate surrender was at Liverpool, with the Shenandoah. So immediately you start throwing that into people. Do you know where the last surrender of the Civil War was? About 5 miles that way in Liverpool. So, whoa, really? And that link, we try and put things into a context that people can understand. And obviously, if we start throwing American stuff at them, it tends to confuse people a little bit. But you start throwing that context of, really, that's just on my front door. It strikes home with people. So that's always memorable when you're having those conversations, and you can see that surprise in people's faces when they realise how close this huge conflict was to us here in the UK.
Oh, absolutely. And people tend to get lost when it comes to, or when us like Civil War nerds are explaining battle tactics and different formations, and the red and blue lines on maps. Like, we love that stuff, but the common person, it goes right over their heads. But if you can make that, if you can make that connection to bring it closer to home, and one thing that I always tell people is about 2 or 3 miles from where I'm currently sitting was one of the last skirmishes of the Civil War. A detachment of Stoneman's cavalry ran into Joseph Wheeler's Confederate cavalry, and it was a hour-long skirmish, but 5 soldiers were killed about like 2 or 3 miles from where I'm sitting, and thousands of cars drive through the intersection where it happened every day. And if I can make that connection to them, like, hey, do you know where this is? Well, this is where this happened, and people just like, oh, like it's like a whole new world opens for them. Like, I had no idea.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that.
Yeah, if you can bring it down to their level and not get them lost in the weeds, it's so much more powerful.
Yeah.
So with you being in the 24th, how many guys are in your unit currently?
So I'd still say we're quite small. We're an independent group. There's a couple of big societies, American Civil War societies in the UK. One north, one south. We're independent. We kind of go everywhere. And at the minute, we've probably got, if we put every firer out into the field, we can probably put maybe 12 to 14 guys out.
Okay. And I was gonna say, what kind of events do y'all have, either with the two different groups or just by yourself? What events do you set up at?
A mix. We try and mix it up. So not every event's the same. So we've done our first event this year, which was in North Wales, and so to be fair, it's grown into a huge multi-period event. You've got everything from Roman cavalry right through to it cuts a bit close to the bone for me, but there's lads that do Optelic and Herrick, so Iraq and Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got everything from those 2 points and everything in between. So it's from what we were doing there, it's quite a small part of the whole event. But we dug, for the first time, a Civil War period trench and kind of lived in that. And it's a bit different. It was certainly more of a living history focus. Whereas we'll go to events with one or two of the big societies, and it'll be more of a battle reenactment event. There'll be more firing involved and things like that. And again, we try and do anything in between. So we've got an event later in this in the year where it's split. It's 50-50. One day is purely for photographers, and it's for them to come along. They'll ask you to do certain poses or go places or do things or whatever else. We'll do firing, but it works both ways because the photographers have got an interest in history, but obviously their hobby is photography. That's what they do, and we get some pretty cool pictures out of it as well. So it works both ways. So we do that, and then the second day is open to public. So we try and do a mix of events to kind of spice it up, keep it going. And we've got an event late. I think it's our last one of the year as well, which is going to be completely new for us. There is a place in the Midlands it's more of a Wild West town, for want of a better description, but it's going to make a good period setting for an 1860s sort of town, rather than just being in a green field, lots of tents or whatever else. To have a sort of a suburban setting is going to be very, very different again. So we try and mix it up just so that we're not getting bored as well.
Right.
We're experiencing new things.
Right. And that's kind of the burnout for us here. If you're not doing a battle or something, there are very few opportunities outside of like public festivals or street festivals where people or different groups can set up. It's either one or the other, and it's awesome that you guys have that opportunity. So do the guys in your unit, do they research in individual people and take on the persona of individual people in the 24th, or do they kind of create their own?
No, we don't do either, really, to be honest with you. We research the individuals that went before us in the 24th, just to keep their story and their history and what went on. We do it to keep that alive. But at an event, we don't take on the persona, the character of guys that were originally in the 24th. We tell their stories, and go through the history of these people and the regiment, but we don't do it in character per se. We're just, ourselves. But a couple of us do research into individuals, and we try and build what we can, just purely just to keep their story alive.
What are some of the more fascinating stories that have come out of Company A?
Yeah, God, that's a big old book to open, isn't it? Wow. I mean, there's so many, really. There's so many. I'm really, really struggling. Yeah, wow. That's a really good question. That is a really, really, really good question. I mean, stuff that's, we'll touch, again, I keep saying this, but we'll touch on this, I'm sure, with another question that you've got. But we were blessed and lucky enough to be able to visit the States for Gettysburg 160. But not only that, we were extremely honoured to be able to get to Floyd. We were invited down to Floyd, and to chat to people there. And the original captain of the 24th, Captain Stiegelman, to hear his story and from people in the community, and it seems strange, but for a lot of people, it's not that far back in history. It's not that far back in generations. So it's just so different hearing a verbal history from a local community, local sources, rather than just reading about it on the internet. So that for me is definitely a standout when you start talking to people that know the family or know the links and whatever it may be. The other thing that just constantly blows my mind is we quite often get people get in touch with us through the Facebook group or Facebook page, website, whatever it may be, who are descendants of guys that were in Company A. And it just honestly blows my mind, the fact that obviously there's people that care about their family history, that they're obviously online looking for something, perhaps a bit like you were, and they come across us, and it's that verbal bit again, getting their history. So we've been lucky enough to get descendants of guys that were in Company A who have got in touch and said, "Oh yeah, so and so was my relative, and here's a bit more to his story. Here's a bit more about him and what happened to him." And all of a sudden, you're going from a very patchy story to starting to piece things up, and it just becomes more real, more human, and that really does just kind of blow my mind. It happens a lot more than I thought it ever would do. Where people would get in touch and say, "Hey, whoever it may be is my relative." It's like, wow, it's incredible. It really is incredible.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I've noticed. The older I get, when I was younger, the battles and the maneuvers and the tactics fascinated me. But the older I get, the more I love hearing about the personal stories, and the connections. And here in Southwest Virginia, you find that a lot of people are still in the same places that their families were generations ago. For example, I live just up the road from a farm that was given to my fifth great grandfather as a signing bonus for signing on in the American Revolution, and his family still owns that land and still farms it. So it's stories like that, and I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of those across Southside, Southwest Virginia, and like Floyd County. You mentioned a last name in Floyd County. Oh, that's so and so. He lives just down the road, and it's so cool because you can make those connections.
Yeah,
because the families are still there. They can take you to the family cemetery. It's like, oh yeah, I know them. I went to school with that family. Or
yeah, definitely. It's that real personal link that just it really does blow your mind. If you're lucky enough to be able to speak to people, it's incredible. It really is incredible.
Yeah, and Floyd is a very interesting town. What did y'all think of Floyd?
Love it.
Love it.
Okay. Honestly, absolutely loved it. It just, it really does blow your mind. If you're lucky enough to be able to speak to people, it's incredible. It really is incredible.
Yeah,
Love it. Love it. Absolutely. Absolutely loved it. It just, it really does blow your mind. If you're lucky enough to be able to speak to people, Love it. Honestly, absolutely loved it. It just, Yeah, it's a bit weird, because it felt like home.
Really?
Yeah, it really did feel like home. I mean, I know it's 3,500 miles away or whatever, but where we are, we're kind of on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, which is quite hilly and whatever else, and a lot of green fields, and
Mm.
just kind of being in Floyd, it wasn't too dissimilar to where I'm from, and it just, I don't know if it just there's something. I still struggle now, putting it into words. I still feel there's something missing. Having been there, I don't know whether I've left part of me there or something else has come home. I don't know,
Wow.
but it just, yeah, beautiful place, lovely people.
Oh, absolutely. It's as far as like scenery goes, like just driving to Floyd's one of those beautiful drives around here, and in the town, it's quaint and everything is right there. It's a very interesting place if you've never
Mm.
visited Floyd, and it sounds like you're itching to come back. So hey,
Oh yeah,
come on back
oh yeah.
anytime.
We'd love to. It's just saving the pennies up, saving the pennies
Yeah,
up.
yeah, I understand that. So, kind of switching gears here, what goes into recreating the 24th Virginia as far as equipment, weaponry? What goes into it for y'all?
Same as, to be fair, most self-respecting living history reenactment groups. We put the time in, or some of us do, because ultimately at the end of the day, this is a hobby. You get out of it what you want. Some people are happy to turn up, put the gear on, and they're authentic, but they don't want to put the hours in afterwards and do the research, and that's cool. That's fine. It's a hobby. We're not getting
Mhm.
paid for this. So there's a few of us that do put those hours in, put the time in, and we read what we can, and we find out. Find out what we can from whoever we can. And again, it's amazing how the links that we've got with people in the States, they point us in directions. We've obviously got a mutual friend, Joshua. Josh has been great. He's passed stuff on when we visited verbally. Little tidbits that were. Oh, I didn't know that. So you just learn what you can where you can. As I say, I would suspect that any good living history reenactment group the world over will do this. You'll have people that will do the research, look at what's what, and we try and be as authentic as we can be. We have a generic sort of mid-war impression, so mid 1863, but we do tilt one way or the other if needs must. So few of us have got an early war impression, so we can drop the 1853 Enfields. We'll pick up the 1842 Springfields that they carried before Gaines Mill. So we can go that way, or like we did at our last event, we ran it as a sort of a Petersburg 1864. So we drop the grey and the button up, and we pick up a lot of English Army cloth jackets and trousers and things like that. So it's more accurate to the time periods that we know that they were getting issued English Army cloth jackets rather than jean cloth and button up and whatever else. So we do put the research in, and we just try to be as authentic as we can be. Simple as that. We want to be the best representation of these guys that we can.
And do you guys have a source over there for your uniforms, and how do you get your rifles and stuff?
Yeah, so obviously over here in the UK, gun laws are a little bit different.
Yeah.
So yeah, you've got to have a shotgun or firearms license over here to handle black powder. You've got to have an explosive certificate and all sorts of stuff. So everybody that shoots, just about everybody in our group's got these licenses. They're issued through the regional police forces. The shooting community in this country is a lot bigger than people might think. It's very, very strict in terms of the laws and what you can't do, so on and so forth. But because the community is a lot bigger than you think, the guns are not that hard to come by. They're really not. The uniforms are probably more troublesome to get hold of, because there's nobody really over here that dedicates themselves for the American Civil War.
Right.
It's not a huge period over here for us. So it's it's trying to put the legwork in to find sutlers and guys that make, you know, uniforms, costumes, whatever you want to call it, that will do stuff for us, as well as buying from the States. You know, so a lot of our guys have got, myself included, you know, we've got bits from sutlers, from guys in America, and we've had it shipped over, you know, because it's the best place. Simple as that. There's no place better than, you know, where it was originally made, where it came from, to go and get the stuff. So if it's worth it, if it's a good reproduction and meets the standards and so on and so forth, then we'll get it from wherever we can. Because for us, the avenues that we can go down to source kit, whether it be guns, leatherwork, uniforms, whatever, it's really limited for us. So we'll kind of get it from wherever we can.
Awesome. Yeah, I was figuring that y'all got it from the States, being that it's a lot more common here. But I didn't know if there was like a little niche provider over there. Or
there is for certain things. You know, there's a guy that's maybe about an hour from where I am, and he makes historical costumes for anything and everything. And he's really good. There's a chap called James Graves, and he's done a few bits for me and guys in the group. But his waiting list he's closed his books now until the end of the year. You know, he did my English Army cloth jacket that I wore at my last event, and I had to wait probably a year and a half for it. You know, so it's a case of you just do what you can to put you on, and then when you can get the good bits, you kind of go for it.
So you mentioned that you all visited Gettysburg on your trip over here. What was that experience like, and did you visit any other battlefields while you were in the States?
Mind blowing, absolutely. It was a very, very kind of out of body experience. It's very surreal. It just didn't feel like we were in these places. So probably easier to flip your question and answer it kind of back front. You know, so when we were over, we came over for Gettysburg 160, and the guys in the New River Rifles, the 24th in the States, they looked after us, and they just phenomenal people. Just couldn't do enough for us, and genuinely a lot of planning went into the trip, and speaking to Ed Fortune and John McPeak and guys in the New River Rifles before we came out for probably 2 years. We were talking, you know, so it felt like we knew them really well. We kind of arrived as friends already, but we left as family. Really did leave as family, and those guys were just fantastic for us and put us in touch with a few people, Joshua being one. And when we got to the States, we hit a load of, basically we were there for nearly 2 weeks, and we just hit as many places as we could, but we tried to do it in a circular route to a degree. So we flew into Dulles. Obviously that's on the edge of Manassas. So we flew in, stayed in the hotel that night, just on the edge of Manassas battlefield. Did obviously 1st, 2nd Manassas, our first day, and then up to Harper's Ferry. Had a look around Harper's Ferry, and just blown away by the scenery, and you know, just those little things. Obviously, the history that happened there, but also one of those little things. If you've seen the films, we all know that, you know, Gods and Generals, part of it was filmed there for Fredericksburg, and just kind of go, yeah, I recognise that. Yeah, wow. You know, it's these little things that you've seen, and you sort of like, it's there. Wow, yeah. So we went from there, Harper's Ferry, after doing all that sort of Hollywood bit. We stayed just outside of Sharpsburg or Antietam, whichever side of the river you fall on that one. We stayed there for a couple of nights, and we spent a full day at Sharpsburg, and just kind of had to take it in because it's just phenomenal.
I agree.
It's probably one of my favourite places that I visited whilst I was there. That's just me personally. I can't really explain why, but just something about it. But we then went into Gettysburg. We had only a day, but we had a day at Gettysburg to try and see as much as we could. And unfortunately, when we were there, Little Round Top was closed. They were doing all this refurbishment that the Park Service had been doing and whatever else. So we couldn't go and see the highlights of Little Round Top and things like that. But we saw as much as we could in the day. We had 3 days for the event there. And then we kind of headed to the end of the Shenandoah Valley via Cashtown. So stopping at Cashtown Inn, as you do, and then we kind of went up the valley. So we stopped at Newmarket, Lexington. We did VMI, Jackson's Grave. We then hit straight down into Floyd because we were invited down there. So we stopped in Floyd for the night. Then from Floyd to Appomattox, where we met Joshua, and Joshua then kindly took us round at Sailors Creek as well, and then into Richmond, Tredegar Ironworks, just whatever we could hit in the time that we had, and from there to Fredericksburg back up to DC, and then home. So we've tried to do it in a big loop and just hit as much as we could within the time that we had, really.
And you mentioned some places that are near and dear to my heart. My background is Newmarket, and I'm a VMI graduate myself. So I've spent 4 years there, right there in Jackson Arch, back when Jackson's statue was just outside of barracks. And we used to do runs up to his grave and back, and so very, very fun years for me. And next time you're in it, because it sounds like you need to come back to go to Little Round Top. If you're in the area, I could show you around Danville. The last capital of the Confederacy. That's my hometown. So
I'll take you up on that, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that. And show you some Civil War stuff around there. I mean, we're not too far away from Lynchburg, so we can make a whole day of just that.
Yeah, definitely.
So being from the UK and looking at the Civil War from a perspective of not having an active role in it, because it's still a very touchy subject here 160 years later. I mean, there's always a constant controversy of the flag or memorials. Looking at it from an outside perspective, what are some of your thoughts on the American Civil War, and what perspectives do you have on it?
Look, it's history. You can't change it. It's as simple as that. You can start getting into all the nitty gritty and who did what to who and what was right, what was wrong, but it happened. It's as simple as that. We on our social media, our website, and at events, we're not interested in politics. We're just not. Mm-hmm. We don't bring that aspect into it. Obviously, it was a huge part of the Civil War and why it happened and what went on, but we don't engage in that. We're not interested, purely because we know what can happen. You don't want to get involved with in a slanging match with public, and we're not there for that. We're just not there for that. From the outside, to a degree, looking in at what's happened over your way, for me, it's really sad. I get that there's certain nerves that have been touched. People thinking that certain things are wrong, but you've lost part of your history there. When things have been destroyed and pulled down and burned and whatever else, you've lost your history. You can't replace that. Whether you agree with it or not, that's a different conversation. But just because you don't agree with something doesn't mean you've got the right to go and erase it. You haven't. I've had this conversation quite a few times with quite a few different people from loads of different places, and I fully respect and I fully understand that if somebody came along, for example, and said, the Confederate battle flag it's racist. Okay, fine, that's your opinion. I respect that. You're entitled to that opinion. But trying to erase everything to do with the Civil War in the South because you don't agree with it is wrong. And on that same principle, this is what I throw back at people. Well, over here in Europe, we don't campaign to go and bulldoze Auschwitz because we don't agree with the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
The way that I look at it, it's the same thing. It's history. You know, if you don't agree with it, good, because it should mean that you're not going to repeat it. You're learning from it. But because you don't like it, doesn't mean you get to wipe it from the history books. So it feels, I don't know if a lot of people over your way feel the same, but it just feels a shame to see things being destroyed, erased, pulled down, whatever it may be, because somebody doesn't agree with it. The way it should work, it's just my opinion purely, and I'm sure there'll be people listening, watching this, whatever else, that'll think, what's he on about, the idiot? But it's just my opinion. You should be able to have a conversation. You should be able to trade ideas and theories and whatever else. And if we don't agree, you know, if we have this conversation, and you might even be listening to me right now thinking, weirdo. But if we don't agree on something at the end of the day, we still should be able to have a beer or whatever and part as friends. We're entitled to opinions.
I agree with you 100%. And in fact, I might just go and isolate those at last minute or two just to have, you know, make a separate video just off of that. Because I mean, you're exactly right. And you know, we could talk about this more after we stop recording. But there's there's a lot of people here who are very much hurt and bothered by something that happened 4 or 5 generations ago, and they tend to live in that currently. And it's you know, kind of hard to get them to, you know, see it see the Civil War and what happened, you know, 200 years ago as history. Like, yes, this thing happened, but we need to learn from why it happened, what happened, so we can move forward and not do this thing again. And like you said, you know, with the destruction of monuments, the, you know, encroachment on battlefields, and just the total erasure of history from textbooks and just from the public, you know, sight, and you know, within a couple generations, you're going to lose it.
Yeah, very quick.
And then, you know, that's going to put you in danger of repeating it, you know. So it seems like it's just been a hard overcorrection here. And that's kind of what we're dealing with now. But on that same line of thought, you did say, you know, that, you know, people of history across the world know the American Civil War. What do you think about the American Civil War, that 4-year period, makes it so fascinating to people across the world?
Well, I think people have got obviously their own connections, but if I talk a little bit about our connections here, and this is kind of what makes it fascinating for us, is the UK links are a lot bigger than people may realise. You know, we touched on that last sort of Confederate surrender being at Liverpool. You know, within 2.5 to 3 miles of where I'm sat right now, there was a company during the war. They actually folded in the 1960s. They were called Greenwood and Batley, and they were one of the biggest suppliers of machinery and machinery making parts to the Confederacy to make armaments. You know, and that's 2.5, 3 miles from my front door. I used to live in a mill that spun cloth that was sold to the Confederacy. You know, the links are so close to home. It's unbelievable. And it's been estimated over 50,000 Brits, you know, fought on both sides during the war. So the links are a lot closer to us here in the UK than a lot of people around the world may think. And I think that rings true for around the world, that there are links. It really is kind of a world war, you know, the American Civil War. When you look at it, it impacted countries around the world. There were engagements on the seas literally around the world, and it touched all 4 corners of the globe. And it's fascinating how that has an impact. But even if it's just down to that base level of the causes of the Civil War, I think everybody's kind of heard of it, and the aspects that were affected, you know, by the war and the result of the war. But to whatever your interest may be, I certainly think that most people around the world have heard of it. Whether they realise it's had a bigger impact than they think, I don't know. But I think people have certainly heard of it. And with what's happened in recent times as well, I think it's kind of brought it back into the forefront of people's minds.
Right. And like you said, I think if you look into the war and the details hard enough, no matter what your history or where you come from, I think you can always find a connection somewhere.
Yeah, for sure.
It's the some of them are glaringly obvious, like you said, with the British connection, or if you want to take it a little bit to the east to Germany with guys like Franz Siegel and um, Julius Stahl, guys like that who fought at Newmarket behind me. That was my first
Yeah,
thought. But if you want to find it, you could probably make a connection somewhere.
definitely.
And the tactics used, I think, were unlike anything in any war had ever seen at that point.
Mm.
Um, um, and you feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But I think the Civil War was, it was the last of what I would like to call like the old formation wars, with fighting in battle lines, and the reason there was so much carnage was it was the old tactics with new weaponry, which just made it a complete bloodshed at times. But it was guys like Jackson and Lee who were making those maneuvers that hadn't been seen before because they had years studying the Napoleonic Wars, the American Revolution. They were taking all of these things from foreign wars and things that they learned about in war colleges, West Point, and then they were taking it and kind of perfecting it with the terrain that they had, the mountains of Virginia or going into Maryland and Pennsylvania. To me, that's why I think it's fascinating. Is there's no doubt in my mind that the generals were studying, Napoleon's moves, or
Absolutely.
so it's if you want to make a connection, there's one right there. The stuff that they were using in battle, they learned somewhere.
Yeah, well, it was the last great conflict. So you think about those guys, Jackson, Lee, whoever you want, Grant, McClellan, the guys north and south that were at these military academies, they're going to, I'm probably preaching to converted being a graduate of VMI, but you're going to study the most recent conflicts, and the last great conflict before the Civil War was the Napoleonic period, Napoleonic Wars. So that's going to have been scrutinized A to Z. It's going to go through it front to back, and without a doubt, the great commanders that came out of that war. They will have taken what they can, learn from it, and adapted it, and taken it forward. But you've hit the real nail on the head. There's old tactics, just rapidly overrun by the technology and the weaponry that was involved. Certainly at the beginning of the war. But what I find interesting as well is at the end of the war, you've got a very small window, a very small opening, and a glimpse into something that is going to occur a few years later in the First World War. You've got trench warfare and mines warfare, all that sort of stuff. So you go very, very, very quickly from that old linear warfare and standing shoulder to shoulder in long lines, and to trench warfare in a very, very short space of time. And it's frightening, really, how rapid that change occurred.
Right. Yeah, and I was about to say that too. You could see glimpses of what's coming with just sieges and just the absolute bombardment of some cities, and cutting supply lines off, and those tactics you start to see them early in the 19th century. But the Civil War was kind of the birth of what we would consider like modern warfare tactics, and especially with World War One and World War Two. So, switching gears again, if you had any advice to somebody who is wanting to get into living history, be it in the UK or here in the US, what's some advice you would give to them?
So I've been doing this for sort of 20 years now, and I've always said the same thing. People, whatever it may be, for me, reenactment living history, it's a 50-50. 50% is the interest in the period that you want to do, whatever that may be. Whether it's Roman stuff, American Civil War, Vietnam, World War II, whatever it may be. You've got to have the interest in that period. Simple. The other 50% is social. You've got to get on with the people that you're going to join the group, whatever that group it may be, whether it's artillery, cavalry, infantry, whatever. So if either of those two aspects don't work, it ain't going to work for you. You either need to find a different group or a different period. So for me, my advice I've always given to people, and I always probably will, is, make sure that that is the period that you're interested in. If you're interested in multiple periods, it's cool, nothing wrong with that, but just make sure that if it's your first steps, that's the one that you're really interested in taking your first steps in reenactment with. And I don't know about guys in the States, but the way that we work, if we get a new recruit, if you like, we invite them to an event first and foremost, at least one event, and it's a two-way street. They've got to like us, we've got to like them because of that social aspect. As I said, we've been blessed enough to visit the States, and spending 12 days with each other, you're in and around each other in close quarters a lot. So you've got to get on with each other. That's not to say that we just reject people, but we want recruits. Everybody wants a fabulous, massive unit as a reenactment group, but we also want people that have got the enthusiasm, the history side of it, and the social side of it. So that for me is the advice, 50-50. Make sure that's the period in history that you want to focus on, and make sure the group's right for you and you get on with the people that are in the group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with that 100%. It's you can have all the book knowledge in the world, but if you have trouble fitting in and explaining that book knowledge to people, and that's a problem. But on the other hand, if you are extremely sociable but you can't answer basic questions and don't really have a desire to know basic questions, then finding that balance is
absolutely. The bottom line to remember through it all is it's a hobby. I think we've all got stories of people we've bumped into in the hobby where they get a bit power hungry and they start to believe in their own self-importance and whatever else. But ultimately, this is your hobby. It's going to be your hobby. You want to enjoy it. You want to go to events. You don't want to feel like you have to go to an event. So it's really crucial that you do fit in, because you don't want those negatives. I've got to drive 5, 6, 7 hours to get to an event now because you feel like you have to. You should be like, I can't wait for that event. You want to go. So it's your hobby. Make sure you want it.
Right, absolutely. And do you have any tips or advice for keeping it fresh and staying motivated, especially when you have those 5, 6, 7 hour drives ahead of you? Any advice to just to stay motivated?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Really, really good question. For me, I think it's spicing it up, keeping the events different. If you do the same thing in the same place year after year after year, it's not good. You'll rapidly lose members. You'll lose the interest. The enthusiasm will just evaporate. So for me, it's about spicing things up, keeping the events different, doing a mix of things, whatever it may be, whether it's a battle reenactment, a photography event, doing a more immersive living history thing, whatever it may be. Just, I think the way forward is to keep things different. Obviously, we're focusing on that one period in history, but if we can do it in different ways, in different locations, it keeps it fresh. Going new places, because ultimately, touching on the last question we just talked about, it's your hobby. You're paying to be there. You don't want to go to the same place time after time after time, and
right.
We're paying to be there, so why can't we enjoy being there? If whatever it may be, whether over here, the first event of the year, it was North Wales, but it's in the grounds of an old stately home. So why can't we enjoy looking at that stately home whilst we're there? So it's that kind of thing for me, where you keep it open, minded in where you go, what you do, and you have a variety. I think that's key.
Well, Gareth, I won't keep you anymore. I know it's getting late over there, and you said you had to
Okay.
put your kids to bed. But is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to explain, or you want people to know before we sign off?
Oh, not particularly. You know, I suppose I hope we've covered kind of why, or certainly touched a little bit on why this period is so fascinating for us. You know, everybody's aware of the Enfield links, you know, the guns that went over north and south, but there are an awful lot more personal stories that link us to you guys. So we hope we've touched on that a little bit and explained why it might seem a bit weird that Brits are doing a bit of American history, but it's a fascinating period for us, and really, unless you've got any other burning questions, the only other thing that I'd say is it's genuinely been an absolute honour to speak to you, and hopefully we've sparked a little bit of interest in some people.
Oh, absolutely. And I think once people see this and they hear your story, that's definitely going to spark some interest in getting out and learning more and doing more, or if nothing else, just taking in and making those connections that are right there within their family or within their community that have been there all along. Just to create that desire to make those connections, to make it personal. It
Yeah.
isn't just a series of maps and maneuvers and you know these famous generals who you see all over the place. It's the personal stories that make the Civil War what it is.
Yeah,
And
and it's that keeps the history alive.
absolutely. And like I said, we will have to get you and Joshua back on here later just to talk 24th. You know,
I'd love it. I'd be honoured. I really would.
and I know he would as well. He spoke very highly of you. Well, Gareth, like I said, I'll let you head on to bed here, and because I know it's getting later over there, and I greatly appreciate this, and we will definitely talk to you later.
Jared, thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate it.